Welcome to our study of 1 Kings. 1 Kings is about how Yahweh judges Israel's idolatry by exiling them to foreign lands. 1 and 2 Kings give no explicit evidence for authorship. Jewish tradition, as contained in the Babylonian Talmud, suggests that Jeremiah was the author. Some have argued that the similarities between Jeremiah 52 and 2 Kings 24 and 25 support Jeremiah as the author. We know that there was a tradition of the prophets keeping written records. The prophets are given prominence in these books, which would further argue for a prophetic influence on the authorship. But Jewish tradition is just that. 1 Kings spans a period of 130 years, from the ascension of Solomon in 971 BC to the reign of Ahaziah in 841 BC. The nation begins as a united monarchy and transitions to a divided monarchy. Israel moved from a people united in worship to peoples divided in worship and warfare. Jerusalem was the capital under Solomon, but the book closes with three cities, Jerusalem, Bethel, and Dan, vying for the people's worship and allegiance. 1 and 2 Kings were probably written throughout the period of the united monarchy to the Babylonian exile from 971 to 586 BC. There are two references in 1 Kings that demonstrate that the book was written over a period of time. 1 Kings 8:8 speaks of the existence of the ark in the inner sanctuary to this day, which would not have been true at the close of 2 Kings. 1 Kings 12:19 states that Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day, which would have been true only at the close of 2 Kings. These passages show that 1 and 2 Kings were written throughout the period and then finalized as one document after the Babylonian deportation. Since there is no reference to the decree of King Cyrus of Persia that allowed the Hebrews to return to Jerusalem, the final composition was probably completed prior to 539 BC when King Cyrus issued the decree. Since 2 Kings concludes with the release of Jehoiachin, the final form must have been completed shortly after 560 BC. Since 1 and 2 Kings appear to have been written under prophetic influence, over the period of these events, the first recipients were probably the Israelites living during the transition from the united monarchy to the divided monarchies, 971 to 722 BC. The final form of 1 and 2 Kings would have been given to the nation in exile, since it closes with historical accounts of the three Babylonian deportations. This history was a period of transition, not only for Israel nationally, but for the Middle East internationally. During the Solomonic reign, Israel ruled militarily, socially, and economically. Solomon had established his military presence throughout the trade routes, resulting in his control of international business and politics. Egypt was weak under the dominance of Israel. The many sins of Solomon unfortunately led to civil war and national apostasy. God raised up Assyria and then Babylon to punish Israel and Judah respectively for their sins. The argument or summary statement of 1 Kings is that Israel's degeneration and judgment into exile, because of its idolatrous kings and apostate people, is delayed by Yahweh's gracious work in a few godly prophets and kings. A major purpose of 1 Kings is to show the exiled and chastised people that the success or failure of the kingdom depends on the obedience of the king and the people to Yahweh's laws and covenants. Some key verses are 1 Kings 6, verses 12 and 13. It says, concerning this house which you are building, if you will walk in my statutes and execute my ordinances and keep all of my commandments by walking in them, then I will carry out my word with you, which I spoke to David your father. And I will dwell among the sons of Israel, and I will not forsake my people Israel. Some major themes in 1 Kings is Solomon's disobedience, God's fulfillment of his promises, the importance of wisdom, the influence of foreign wives, idolatry, good kings versus bad kings, a contrast between the kings and the prophets. We certainly see the decline of the nation, and you will discover more themes as you read 1 Kings. An exegetical outline of 1 Kings can be divided into two major divisions. First, the United Kingdom under Solomon's rule, that's chapters 1 through 11. In these chapters we read of how Solomon ascends to the Davidic throne. David gives Solomon some final advice and then dies. Solomon quickly consolidates his kingdom and receives wisdom and fame from God. Solomon builds and dedicates the temple for the Lord God. The Lord covenants with Solomon and prospers him. Solomon's sins lead to the downfall of the kingdom. The second division, we have the divided kingdoms of Israel, that's the 10 northern tribes, and Judah, the 2 southern tribes, in chapters 12 through 22. In these chapters, we read about the division of the kingdom under Rehoboam, the reign of Jeroboam over Israel, the evil reign of Rehoboam over Judah, the sinful reign of Abijam and Asa over Judah, the evil kings of many others, including Omri and Ahab. The evil reign of Ahab over Israel is judged by Elijah. We see the evil reign of Jehoshaphat over Judah and the evil reign of Ahaziah over Israel. Now let's put our feet into the sands of time so that we may read or listen to the history of Israel's transition from the united monarchy to the divided monarchies. The northern king of Israel has had 20 kings, and every one of those kings did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. The southern kingdom of Judah had 19 kings. 11 were evil, and 8 were good to varying degrees. The nation had spiritually collapsed into idolatry, immorality, and apostasy. The judgment of the Lord God had sent the 10 northern tribes into Assyrian captivity and the 2 southern tribes into Babylonian captivity. The preserving influence of the prophets like Elijah and Elisha is gone. You are living in a foreign land under foreign dominance. You and your family have been carried off into exile after a brutal invasion. You are surrounded by foreign gods and temples, and you are wondering, where is God? What happened to the covenant nation of Israel? Has God forsaken his people? You must read to understand why the Lord God judged his people. You want to learn how the obedience or disobedience of the kings and people brought consequences on the nation. God was faithful to Israel by providing prophets and a few good kings to rebuke the people. The people have been unfaithful and rebellious as they have rejected the prophets and good kings. You must keep the faith while you are in exile. Someday you will be allowed to return to your homeland. You hope, and you want your family to know how to remain in covenant with the Lord God so that you can prosper spiritually and economically under the blessings of the Lord.